Well, we're back at it here at Mark's Game Room after an unplanned stay in the hospital. Now, I finally got out when Charlie, Austin, and I attended Barrage, a small local wargaming event north of Baltimore run by the Hawks, a great group of veteran gamers. Hey, Austin, say hi.
Hey.
Among all of the interesting games being run, Austin sat down at a game and found himself in a time warp back to 1967.
Well, I think it's really pretty and it's really impressive to look at.
And Austin, tell me, what game did you play?
So I played a 7 Years War game. It's not necessarily a period that I game a lot, so I figured, might as well just try it, see how it goes. And I learned fairly quickly when I got to the table that it is using a rule set from 1967.
1967, the year I was born, which means these rules are 57 years old.
Right, I'm 25.
25.
So that's double, maybe a little bit more.
Okay, he's playing a set of rules more than twice his age. So tell me, what was it like as a 25-year-old to play these ancient rules?
Well...
So as soon as we sat down to the game, I looked at these 1,000 figures, which was pretty impressive, and I thought, why is someone using rules from 1967 for this game?
And so we decided to ask the guy running the game.
Why do I use these rules from 1967? I originally did this because back in the late 1980s, I was a reader of the Midwest Wargamers Association newsletter and read about the idea that various people were in those days reviving Charge. So it looked interesting. I got a copy of the rules. We don't ordinarily play with 1,000 figures at a time, but the rules will work if you do that. Wow, when Bob started playing Charge, it was already a revival in the 1980s from the 1960s.
So this game has really stood the test of time, and I wondered, why is that? According to Board Game Geek, Charge is one of the foundational texts establishing the modern miniatures wargame hobby. That's a big deal. And I wonder what was in Austin's head when he was about to embark on the origin story of the hobby.
Yeah, so my first impressions of the game, it was really cool seeing it looked like maybe 6 to 8 tables worth of these big miniatures based on these really big sort of plaques. And I gotta say, kids and guys back in the 60s must have been much, much stronger because those plates were heavy.
Now, the big 40mm metal miniatures made a big impression on Austin, and I would agree that 1,000 of them is an incredible sight. So, how much would these minis have cost back in 1967? Well, a loaf of bread was 22 cents, a gallon of gas, 33 cents. I can never see that again. I can't really say how much these minis cost, because you couldn't buy them.
And then Mark was like, yeah, these are flat figures. We had to, or, back in those times, you had to get a mold and you had to, pour some metal, lead, or pewter of some kind in there to, create the model. It's kind of like the 3D printing of that generation. So I was like, wow, that's like a whole process in and of itself. And anyways, it's not my time, obviously.
Although I was born in 1967, I really don't know anything about games back then. I started to look on the internet to see if I could go back in time. Apparently, 1967 was a big year for naval games. Everybody's favorite game, Battleship, was released, which is still a cultural reference that's used by Seinfeld.
You sank my submarine.
Elaine?
At the same time, Jutland, an early war game by the Avalon Hill Game Company, was released. Now, I actually have a 1967 copy of Jutland. Essentially, it's a miniatures game that used printed counters instead of 3D miniatures. Jutland really wanted to make it feel like you were taking command of a World War I fleet. The cover page mentions 4 times that you, in all caps, can take command and win the war. That seemed to be a big selling point of Jutland, that you are not engaged in some abstract game, but in a simulation that puts you on the same footing as the admirals that fought the Great Battle. Very different from the abstract war game that is Battleship. So this philosophy back in 1967 that you're the actual general means that Charge does not have much in the way of leadership rules. And I think Austin felt the difference between that idea and modern games.
No, I think, weirdly enough, I don't think we had any leaders in the game. Maybe I'm wrong, and I apologize if that's the case, but at least for my particular units that I had, we didn't have a general or an officer, anyone giving us any kind of bus whatsoever. And I don't know if that's necessarily a thing about older rules or not, but that was something that was a little bit different for sure. I played as a fictitious general of, I think, a German variant. When you were trying to impact the battlefield itself, you would write down your orders, and you would have things like, oh, you can move full but not shoot, or move half and maybe shoot. And there was sort of some decisions on, where do you attack? Do you attack with everything? Do you kind of hold back and maybe pepper the area a little bit before you go in? So there were definitely plenty of decision points where a commander could try and influence the battle.
So it seems that Charge fits in with this idea from Jutland of you being the general. And I wanted to hear more from the actual game designers, but I don't have the rules, and they're really expensive. So I reached out to the Hawks. They put me in touch with Rob, who sent me some photos of the designer's notes.
In a few hours, I was reading the author's philosophy of the game.
The first line is very telling.
Kid stuff, playing with tin soldiers, the scornful teenager cries. His parent nods a dubious assent. But how wrong? So it's not kid stuff. It's not Battleship. It is more like Jutland. The authors go on to talk about how Charge is in the tradition of the Kriegspiel, or war game developed by the Prussian General Staff of the 1870s. But they come to a point where these two opposite views of wargaming collide when they say, two of the major difficulties inherent in wargaming had emerged. First, the difficulty of producing comprehensive rules which were at the same time intelligible and easy to apply. Clearly the authors, who were both British military officers, were caught between not wanting miniatures gaming to be seen as a kid's game, where they were just playing with toy soldiers, but also as something that was enjoyable for everyone. So are these rules a simple simulation? And do they appeal to modern gamers?
It's relatively simple. It's all D6s. Well, everything except the fractions, and I'll leave you to fill that in.
The fractions. But here's where it got crazy. So something that you don't necessarily see a lot in more modern games is all the fractions. But in this game, you kind of had to do all the fraction calculations in your head. It was a lot of like 7/8, 5/8. As you can imagine, when you're getting into like the 5/8 territory of a fraction and you're able to call that from a die roll, it takes a lot of, I guess, know-how. And that was something I was getting a bit lost with. Something that was missing, at least that I see a lot in contemporary games, is that there's a lot of abstraction in contemporary games, whereas in this one, they like to play out those individual content. I really like this mechanic, honestly. Whenever a unit charged, you actually activated individual figures. If I remember correctly, it was 4 figures at a time. 4 guys would go out, contact 4, and then the other player would activate 4 of theirs. You're sort of going model by model and seeing who wins in a particular combat. To me, was really cool. I like that mechanic, even though at first I was a little bit hesitant, but it was like a little game within a game is the best way I could describe that.
Some of these rules in Charge started to feel very familiar to me, and I realized that there's a classic set of rules from the late 70s that's a direct descendant of Charge.
The Sword in the Flame is still played and was the go-to rules for colonial battles for decades. The original rules used an easy version of fractions to resolve shooting, and melee was done figure on figure. The current descendant of Charge and Sword in the Flame is probably The Men Who Would Be King, or really anything by Daniel Mersey. Now, the shadow that Charge casts over historical miniatures wargaming is long. A game that spans 50 years can offer gamers more than just one fun night at the gaming table.
So along the way, other members of the Hawks have painted contingents. We had 8 or 9 painters worth of material on the table today. About the time that Norman was born, I got the molds for these Prince August figures that we were using. So generally the way I tell the story is that I looked at him in the stroller and thought, someday this is what we're going to play. And now, someday is here.
I think wargaming in general has been a great way to build those father-son connections, but
Brotherly connections as well.
But yeah, definitely working on a project together and working on something that's really very unique, that really unique thing. And we home cast all the figures, so helping out Dad with the home casting is pretty fun too when we get the chance. So it's a really it's a really unique experience to our family.
Yeah, no, I still think there's a good enough reason to play something a little bit more older. I think too often we get comfortable with things that we're more used to, and especially more contemporary games. Like I was saying earlier, I prefer those games because they tend to be a little bit more easier to understand and play. But when you try and venture into, let's say, another decade's worth of games that you're not necessarily used to or a part of the culture of, it can be a little shocking, but you tend to learn a little bit more about the gamers who were playing at that time, what the designers might have been thinking about with the rules, and just some of the processes that they were going to actually, create and play a game.
Okay, Austin, so you've seen the origin story of historical miniatures, and I believe you started in 40K, so you have a different origin story. What do you think now that you've seen where this crazy hobby comes from?
Yeah, so I got started in 40K. I dabbled a little bit in historicals because I thought it looked really cool, and I gotta say, wargaming since 1967 has come a long ways for sure.
That's true, we're in a different place. All right, well that was awesome, man. Good job. Okay, thanks for sticking with us. We got a lot more coming. We're gonna have some more Wargame Time Warps in the future, some really fun stuff. We got Patreon coming, so stick with us. We'll see you all next time.
Y'all were real gamers back then.